in particular did, and I'm not guaranteeing I'm pronouncing this correctly, I'll just give you a preference to that. Gordon Hirabashi, I think is how it's pronounced. Hirabashi was the first Japanese American to resist this treatment. Gordon Hirabashi. He was a student going to college, kids, at the University of Washington when he was relocated, or was going to be relocated. Now, he'd already made enemies within the government because we had a draft, right? And he refused to go. He registered as a conscientious objector. And we'll talk about that because that becomes crucial when we get to Vietnam. Okay?
Is that what the one guy was in Hacksaw Ridge?
Yes, that's exactly what he was. So way back at this time, Hirabashi was already in trouble with the American government because when he was supposed to be drafted, he registered as a conscientious objector. Now, does anybody know what happens when you register as a conscientious objector? Does that mean they say, okay, you don't have to go, No. You have to have what? You have to have a hearing, and then they decide, it's kind of like a court hearing, and you give reasons why you're a conscientious objector, and they have a military jury there, so to speak, and they decide if your reasons are legitimate. If they're legitimate, they don't make you go. Or they might give you a different job depending on what your gripe is. You don't want to kill anybody, so maybe they would put you in a position of non-killing if they thought your reasons were right. If they thought you were full of it, they would say you're going, and if you didn't go, where would you go? To prison. Okay? Well, he registered as a conscientious objector in World War II. Now, when they told him to report to be evacuated to the relocation camp, he refused to do that too. So these Japanese Americans were ordered to report so we can relocate you. You're supposed to report to be evacuated. And he refused. And this is what he said when he refused. You don't have to write this down. I'd like you just to listen to it and see if you get the meaning. So he refuses to report for the Japanese American evacuation, stating, quote, "I wanted to uphold the principles of the Constitution and the curfew and evacuation orders which singled out a group on the basis of ethnicity violated them." And he was right. You're not supposed to discriminate against people in the Constitution. And he said, I want to uphold the principles of the Constitution and the curfew and evacuation orders which singled out a single group based on their race violates the Constitution. That's the reasoning he gave for not reporting. Well, it didn't exactly work. He was arrested and tried for refusing to report and was convicted in 1942. So he was arrested, charged, tried, and convicted of refusing to report for Japanese evacuation. Well, he appealed that decision all the way to the United States Supreme Court. He appealed the decision all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decision went down in history as Hirabashi versus the United States, 1943. And when you go all the way to the Supreme Court, they make a ruling, one way or the other, and I'll explain briefly what their ruling was. So he appealed the decision all the way to the Supreme Court that he would be found guilty of not reporting for relocation. Hirabashi versus the United States happened in 1943, and these are the three things the Supreme Court ruled in this case. Number one, the Supreme Court allowed the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast on the basis of, quote, military necessity. Okay? So the first thing the Supreme Court ruled in Hirabashi versus the United States is they allowed the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast on the basis of, quote, military necessity. Second thing they did, they didn't rule on anything, they actually avoided a ruling on the constitutionality of that incarceration program. They avoided ruling on the constitutionality of the incarceration program. That was the whole basis of what? His appeal, is that they violated the Constitution of the United States by discriminating against these Japanese Americans. So the Supreme Court just avoided that. And so what did their Supreme Court's decision do? It underscored civil liberties during wartime. What does that mean? Kendra, my dear, what do you think that means? If the Supreme Court underscored civil liberties in wartime. What's that mean, Kendra, my dear? They underscored civil liberties during wartime. What's that mean? Okay, you want to, let's see, you want to go to the homecoming dance, and you can't make up your mind whether you want to take this kid or that kid, but you decide to take a kid, and I don't like him because he's black. Well, that doesn't work, does it? I mean, really. But because it's homecoming and it's a pretty serious event, there could be a lot of trouble, I'm going to underscore your rights to take a person of your choice to the homecoming dance. Even though it's not right, I'm doing it. And that's what they did. They basically said no one has any constitutional rights during wartime. And the only people they discriminated against at the time were Japanese people. But that's what they said. That's a weird ruling. Well, this didn't go away. And from 1943 to 1988, this, bothered people. And in 1988, Congress issued a public apology for the relocation of Japanese Americans during World War II. 1988. It took them 40 plus years to admit they did something unconstitutional. And in 1988, they publicly apologized for that. In addition, they awarded each of the approximate 80,000 Japanese Americans that were still living at that time, that were incarcerated, $20,000 each. That happened in 1988. So if you were a surviving Japanese American citizen who was relocated during World War II, in 1988, you received $20,000 from the federal government for their mistake. It was a really awful thing. Do we have people in this community that felt that? Very influential man that gives $3,000 a year in scholarship money. 2 of you this year in your senior class will receive the Grant USA FUSA academic and athletic scholarship. His family were relocated out of this community. And I don't know, I should ask him, it's kind of a touchy subject, so I don't bother him too much. But I don't know if they're relocated to Heart Mountain or where they went, but I'm guessing Heart Mountain.
Well, a lot of them came from Heart Mountain, that's why we have to make that.
That's right.
It's like there's Kentucky, and
Yeah.
there's Michigan,
Yeah, yeah. So we feel it right here. So just a thought. Okay, that'll move us to our next subtopic. Then we've declared war. Now we got to talk about the home front. The home front. We got to get ready. We got to get going back in the United States. Because what are we going to have? We've already had the draft, right, so to speak. It wasn't really a draft. We had to register, right? And these guys had been training for a year, or had been in a year's training. So the draft's going to come about. But we got to get ready. And other than having trained troops, what else do we have to have? So equipment and supplies. So back on the home front in the United States, people who were not fighting for the military were doing their part in other ways. Now this is pretty impressive if you're a farmer. During this time, farmers were producing record-breaking crops during the war. Despite the fact that what? Pretty amazing they could have record crops when 2 million American farmers were doing what? Fighting in the war. So somebody else had to pull up their bootstraps, like miners, women, etc. My father-in-law tells the story a lot. He just turned 90, first of the month. And he was 15 years old, but he was kind of a big kid. And he would walk down the streets of Worland and be criticized because he was a chicken. He didn't go to war. Well, he wasn't old enough to go to war because he was 15, but he looked like he was old enough. And he said it was horrible. So what did he spend his time when he got so much crap for that he did whatever he could to show people what he could do for the war effort at home by helping with this or helping with that. That's what you did. Factories were producing war supplies at record numbers. I'm going to give you some examples that might be amazing to you. I'll give you some statistics on war supplies. And it's between July of 1940 and July of 1945. In a 5-year period of time, I'm going to give you some examples of what was manufactured in the United States. Between that 5-year period of time, United States factories manufactured over 300,000 military planes. You think of that as a number, but I think if you saw 300,000 planes parked next to each other, I think you'd be pretty amazed how many that is. They produced over 100,000 bombers. What's a bomber? Difference between a military plane and a bomber. What's a military plane do? Tactical, short-range fighting. A bomber would be like a B-52 bomber that would be high level that just dropped bombs. Okay, bigger planes, bigger risk. They produced over 90,000 tanks. Over 17,000 armored cars. Now an armored car would be somewhere between a Jeep and a tank. Okay? Kind of like you see over here at the National Guard, those kind of big trucks they have, those are armored cars.
How many?
17,000. About 100,000 military Jeeps were produced in that 5-year period of time. About 100,000 Jeeps. Over 300,000 pieces of artillery. What's a piece of artillery? Anybody know? What's that? Big cannon? Those types of things, pieces of artillery.
Sorry.
About 300,000 pieces of artillery. 2 million Army trucks. 2 million Army trucks. 17 million rifles. 17 million rifles. My goodness. 3 million machine guns. You ever see Saving Private Ryan? How many people have seen Saving Private Ryan? You know the difference? The sergeant always had a machine gun, and most of the other soldiers had rifles. There's the difference. Okay? 42 billion rounds of ammunition. 42 billion rounds of ammunition. That is examples of the manufacturing that was done in factories in the United States between July 1940 and July 1945. Incredible. So, with so many men fighting in the war, who became the workers in these factories? Women. And for the first time in history, women went to work in droves. And the symbol of the working woman in the factories during World War II was known as Rosie the Riveter. And I gave you a picture, and that was great propaganda. Rosie the Riveter. Everybody pull those out. Look at I'll tell you how I'm in. Look at this. A Rosie the Riveter bobblehead. Right here. We can do it. Straight from the American History Museum in Washington, D.C. I had to have it. Rosie the Riveter. She was the standard for working women who worked in the factories during World War II. Now, this was kind of funny last year because Mrs. McDonald, before she retired on homecoming, dressed up as Rosie the Riveter. And not one kid knew who she was. You would know now. Does she look pretty good? Oh, look at that, Mrs. McDonald. She looks perfect. And so I said, we got to get a picture of this, because she said, none of the kids really know who I am. She was Rosie the Riveter. Well, somebody had to pose for that picture. And this lady here was lost for 7 decades. You want to see Rosie the Riveter at 95. This is the lady that posed for the picture that went all over the country. Rosie the Riveter at 95. Okay? All right. So women were a big part. Last subtopic here we have in this little quiz material that we're going to take is financing the war. How did we finance this war? Macklin, you want to guess how much it cost the United States to fight World War II? Take a guess.
Trillion.
Yeah, well, you're a little high, but this is
Billion.
$400 billion. That is in 1945 currency. $400 billion is what the total dollar amount the United States paid to fight World War II. Now, we had fought a lot of wars between 1789 and 1940 in our country. That was twice the amount that the United States government spent for all the wars that we fought between 1789 and 1940. Twice as much as everything we spent in every war we ever fought in. Now, how did we finance the war? It came from two sources. One's pretty easy to figure out. Taxes. Of the $400 billion it cost to fight World War II, 33%, or $132 billion, came from taxes. 33%, or $132 billion, came from taxes. Where'd the other 67% come from? Anybody know? Selling of war bonds. Now, I remember my parents, matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. You could buy savings bonds now, but war bonds, what would happen is people would buy a $100 war bond. And when the war was over, it usually had a time limit like 7 years, but basically what you did is you bought a $100 war bond for $100, and after the war was over, it was worth $130, okay, because they gave you interest. And that kind of metamorphosized into savings bonds, and with the philosophy behind a savings bond is you buy a $100 savings bond for $50, and in 7 years you go cash in for $100. But it's the same type of thing. But people lent the government money through the issuing of war bonds to finance the war. That's how it was done. And they had war bond campaigns that went all over the country. Matter of fact, we were kind of in the middle of the war and we're getting ahead of ourselves. But those Marines that posed for the picture at Iwo Jima, 2 of the survivors were brought back immediately to the United States after this conflict and spent their entire rest of their service campaigning across the country to try to get people to buy war bonds, and they brought in millions of dollars during their campaign. That's how they paid for that. So we're in financing the war. So that ends part 1. We're going to have a little quiz tomorrow. So what we're going to do is we're just going to meet right in here. We will not go to the Commons tomorrow. We'll meet right in here and we'll have a little, probably 30, 40, 50 point quiz. Things I would concentrate on are, setting the stage for the Second World War, know some statistics about how it differed from any other war. I would know the 3 major fronts in Europe, and I would know about the Pacific Theater. I would know the 3 main causes. I probably will not ask you examples of those, but the 3 main causes of World War II. I would know who Winston Churchill was. I would know what Vichy was. I would know what Operation Sea Lion was. I would know what the Burke-Wadsworth Act did. This is all being recorded if you want to, if I'm going too fast. I would know what we did in retaliation to the Japanese occupation of French Indochina. I would know some of the statistics about Pearl Harbor, but I mean, I'm not going to hold you exact. Kind of studied those up a little bit. So you kind of know the numbers of people that were killed, and again, not exact. So 2,400 might be a good number for American soldiers killed, 1,100 wounded, 1,100 killed on the Arizona itself, just general things like that. I would know who Jeanette Rankin was. I certainly would know who Gordon Bashi was. I will not make you spell that name correctly, however. I'll put it in there so you don't have to spell his name. And probably know who Rosie the Riveter was and the ways that we financed the war. Will be about 30-point quiz tomorrow. We'll just kind of take it right in here. How's that sound? And then we'll move on to part 2. What's tomorrow, Thursday?
Yes.
Okay.
What if we're gonna be talking about?
Well, we got some golfers, don't we? Well,